Good afternoon and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland and this week's Full Scottish. My name is Brian Liddy and it's Sunday the 9th of November. On the programme this week we're delighted to be joined by Linda Fabiani, retired MSP and former Deputy Presiding Officer at the Scottish Parliament. Good afternoon, Linda.
Hi there.
Thanks for joining us. It's really
Good to be
appreciate it.
here.
So to start with, we have this week's Middle East update. In Gaza, at least 69,169 Palestinians have been killed and 170,685 wounded in Gaza since the 7th of October 2023. Since the ceasefire agreement came into effect, at least 242 Palestinians have been killed and approximately 614 injured by Israeli forces. Despite the ceasefire, Israel continues airstrikes on Gaza, with Israeli warships shelling near the Gaza seaport and the eastern regions of Rafah. In the West Bank, there are still daily reports of attacks on Palestinian homes and businesses by Israeli settlers, while the IDF look on. Linda, I've been thinking that you may ask why we continue to give a routine update on Gaza, citing an increase in the number of casualties and deaths when there's a ceasefire in place. Personally, I had hoped to be reading my final update on Gaza, and yet here we are, still hearing about casualties and fatalities. What's going on?
Well, the reality is that the Israeli government just isn't respecting the so-called ceasefire. They made the announcement that we'd go along with it. It seems to me that they are looking for every excuse to say that they are justified in breaking the ceasefire. But there's no excuse that I can see that justifies the air and sea strikes on Gaza, on the land, and ongoing, as has been from the very start of this conflict and hardly reported except by organisations like Broadcasting Scotland, and what had been happening for years and years and years before this latest conflict is the stuff in the West Bank. The land grab, the takeovers, but now it's very, very blatant. You have Israeli politicians standing up and saying it's justified and that Israel should be taking the land. You have the Israeli Defence Force standing by while people, including journalists, including international commentators, I understand, I've read a report about that, and including peacekeepers who have voluntarily gone in to try and keep people safe, being injured. And it's all about taking the land over and Israeli expansionism. So I'm glad that you're still reporting it every day, Brian. I wish there was more of an outcry about this. I wish Mr. Trump was standing up and saying this is not in the spirit of any ceasefire. I wish Keir Starmer was standing up and saying the Israeli government is not acting in the spirit of any of this and really condemning this, as well as all the other things we've all been calling for if we have any moral compass, which is stopping the arms sales, stopping referring to ourselves as being a critical friend of Israel and starting to say this is a pariah state. It ends now.
The report said that these attacks happen while the IDF stand by and don't do anything to stop it. Last week I read an article that I think that talked about 4 tribes that had appeared on the scene. Sounded like mercenaries, by any other word, and they were using jeeps and the likes that had Israeli IDF insignias on them, but kind of like badly scratched out. Have you heard anything about that? Is it mercenaries that are causing these attacks, or is it the IDF?
I haven't heard anything particularly about that, Brian, except wee bits here and there. Now, in any conflict situation, you get mercenaries, of course you do. That's just one of the sad realities of warfare, and it has been through the centuries. It's not just a modern phenomenon. But what you have in this particular conflict, whether they're mercenaries or not, those are people, those who are going in and causing attacks in the West Bank, whether it be West Bank residents, whether it be members of the IDF, or whether it be mercenaries. They are doing it under the tacit agreement of the Israeli government. They are acting illegally. The Israeli government is acting illegally. So I don't think that there can be any excuse made for the Israeli government in terms of what's happening there. But no doubt they will be trying to say that they can't really take responsibility because they have not ordered it, in inverted commas. It is a policy they have been pursuing for, in fact, decades now. It's about encroaching on land round about defined Israel, and particularly in the West Bank.
Okay, thank you, Linda. And as you say, you talk about mercenaries in every war, so which there were also mercenaries, or are mercenaries in the war in Ukraine, which we move on to now. Russia is again targeting substations that power the Khmelnytsky and Rivne nuclear power stations in Ukraine. The country's foreign minister, Andriy Sybiha, said on X on Saturday. Sybiha said drone attacks on the weekend were not accidental, but were planned strikes. Russia is deliberately endangering nuclear safety in Europe, he said. Russia launched a barrage of drones and missiles at Ukraine over the weekend, killing at least 7 people and damaging energy infrastructure in 3 regions, according to Ukrainian officials. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Russia had launched more than 450 drones and 45 missiles, most of which were shot down. 3 people were killed and 12 wounded when a drone hit an apartment building in Dnipro, and another person was killed in the Kharkiv region. 3 were killed in the southeastern Zaporizhzhia region, officials said. On Saturday, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said work was underway on Vladimir Putin's order to prepare proposals for a possible Russian nuclear test. Russia says the order is in response to Donald Trump's announcement last month that the US would resume nuclear weapons testing. Russia-US relations have deteriorated sharply in the past few weeks because of Trump's frustration about the lack of progress towards ending the war in Ukraine. A second external power line to the Russian-held Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine has been restored. The station's Russian operators were quoted as saying on Saturday the plant is Europe's largest, with 6 reactors. It was seized by Russian troops in the first weeks of the February 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Currently produces no electricity, but needs external power to cool the nuclear fuel and avoid the risk of a meltdown. Millions of tons of Russian oil have been traded through a port in Singapore, part owned by Australia's Macquarie Bank and potentially sold to Australian businesses, new data shows. The identification of a new link between Australia and the trade in Russian origin products exposes further gaps in government sanctions as Australia lags Europe and UK in tightening import rules. Australia stopped buying fuel directly from Russia after its invasion in Ukraine, but has imported more than 3 million tonnes of Russian-originating oil products since 2023, the Europe-based Centre for Research on Energy and Clean Air has found. Hungary said on Saturday it had obtained an indefinite waiver from US sanctions to use Russian oil and gas, but a White House official reaffirmed the exemption was for 1 year only. Last month, US President Donald Trump imposed Ukraine-related sanctions on Russian oil companies Lukoil and Rosneft that carried a threat of further sanctions against entities that buy oil from those firms. Hungary, which relies heavily on Russian energy, asked for a reprieve from the sanctions. Old fishing nets from France are becoming a vital protection against Russian drones attacking Ukraine. In fishing ports along the coast of Brittany, discarded horsehair fishing nets, previously a waste problem, are being used to catch Russian drones. Russia employs small, cheap drones and fits them with explosives, directing them by remote control for distances of up to 25 kilometres. The Ukrainians' use of nets to create tunnels in which drones' propellers become entangled. Linda, I wonder what is maybe going to take your attention first. The rather odd use of French fishing nets to catch drones, or what sounds like an escalation in nuclear arms.
Mm-hmm. Gosh, both things, Brian. I mean, there was a lot of really interesting information that you reported there, some of which I hadn't heard before. Thank you very much. The thing about the horsehair fishing nets being deployed, before used in off the coast of Brittany and now being deployed by Ukraine, that's fascinating. Unfortunately, it's only a very small bit of the defences that are required. Yeah, the potential nuclear escalation is extremely worrying, and I think it's even more worrying when you've got the two strange men in charge of the world, it would seem at the moment, being Putin and Trump, because neither of them, in my mind, can be trusted in any way whatsoever, and they're now carrying out testing. Remember, I'm old enough, long enough in the tooth to, although I was young at the time, to remember the worries back in the 60s about the nuclear escalation. And it seems like here we are again. We never seem to learn anything. Every year we remember the dead in conflict and wars, generally with loads of respect, and so we should. But we still keep having these wars. We still keep having conflict. And, here we are, 60 years down the line? It's almost like we're heading back to a Cold War, heading back to a nuclear standoff. In the middle of it all is poor Ukraine. The conflict seems to have upped lately in terms of Russia bombing the infrastructure. But Ukraine's retaliations, particularly in Crimea, are quite interesting. And I read an article which I couldn't respond to because it was very technical, but talking about how Ukraine, in the absence of very, very sophisticated weaponry from allies, is making its own bombs, its own targeted attack weapons. So it seems to have upped, and my concern is that Russia just keeps bombarding the infrastructure, and at some point hits the infrastructure so hard that Ukraine can't properly retaliate. There are lots of casualties in Ukraine ongoing. There's also a lot of Russian casualties. I was reading the other day that they reckon it's over 1 million Russian casualties since this started. Putin doesn't seem to care about that, though. He seems to believe his people are expendable. And I think that's a very strong difference between President Putin and President Zelensky. So depressing, particularly on this Remembrance Sunday. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Linda. I'm not sure if I said at the start of that item that today is day 1,355 of the war in Ukraine, and as with Gaza, I'm looking forward to the day when I don't have to read out any more updates in the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
But excuse me. Moving on. This week, New York elected its first Muslim mayor, the Democrat Zohan Mabdani. And in his victory speech, Mr. Mabdani said, New York will remain a city of immigrants, a city built by immigrants, powered by immigrants, and, as of tonight, led by an immigrant. There have been various elections all across the US this week for different kinds of posts, so that there have been other historic Democrat wins from this week, including the first woman elected as Virginia governor, the first Muslim woman also elected to a statewide office anywhere in the country, which is also in Virginia, and the first woman elected mayor in Detroit. Mr. Mamdani ended his victory speech with the words, excuse me, "This city belongs to you." I don't think he was speaking to Donald Trump when he said that. But what do you think this win for Mr. Mabdani means for US politics, Linda?
Oh, I think it's fascinating, Brian, and a bit of a bright spot in an otherwise bad news week, as far as I was concerned. I thought it was really interesting, Mr. Mandani saying that New York is a city. What was it he said? Led by immigrants, and I thought, well, the USA, the political construct that is the USA, the nation, they call it, that is the USA, is a country led by immigrants. And in its modern terminology, always has been. So it's nice to hear that very basic premise of what the USA was built on, restated very, very publicly. And I think it's great that they've elected the first Muslim mayor of New York. But now on to the effect it may have. We should remember that, as you pointed out, it wasn't just he who was successful last week. The Democrats were fairly successful in Virginia and was it New Jersey? It was Democrats elected with good majorities. So I think that's really interesting. The Democrats will have their tails up again, looking at perhaps now having a fight back. They seem to have decided to focus on the cost of living for US citizens, and certainly in New York, that was what the new mayor was focusing on as well during his campaign. However, there's a wee bit of a downside to this, and I understand that there is some disquiet even within the Democratic Party about Zoran Mandani and his politics. Now, from what I've seen and I've read into what he's been talking about, things have been saying, he's certainly not a communist that Donald Trump has been going on about. He seems to me more in the tradition of left-wing sort of democratic socialist type. But there seems to be some disquiet within the Democrat Party about what kind of candidates they will now be electing through the primaries, which have started, candidates electing to fight for Congress next year. So the worst thing they could do would be to allow civil war to divide them now. They're on the up. They seem to have focused on the right things, because although President Trump, one of these immigrants who's building America, by the way, although he is going on about being successful at prices lowering and all the rest of it, he's talking a lot of nonsense as usual. Any interrogation of these broad statements that Trump comes out with can show very clearly that they are completely wrong. So if the Democrats have a bit of discipline about them, if they really look and focus on what they're trying to achieve, and I hope they do it with sincerity, then they could be using this to spearhead the fight back for the Democratic Party. Just don't all start arguing amongst yourselves, because that's fatal for any election campaign.
Thank you, Linda. You kind of hinted at it there. Did Mr. Mamdani's victory speech remind you at all of any Scottish Government policies? Both John Swinney, the First Minister, and Mr. Mamdani, they both use the word hope quite a lot.
They both used the word hope quite a lot, but there was something much more specific, because he actually referenced the Scottish Government's baby box in his, I don't know if it was in his victory speech or shortly thereafter, but he noted that the Scottish Government had started to distribute baby boxes without favour to everyone who was having a child. And he quoted that as something he would aspire to and a policy he would like to take up. So yes, as I said, this is not a scary man. This seems to me a man who wants to do his best for people, who recognises the unfairness in the system, not just in the US, but generally in the Western world, and wants to start a better distribution of wealth across society.
Yeah, I kind of thought some of his policies sounded a bit like SNP policies. But in staying in America, a federal judge has blocked President Trump from deploying the National Guard to Portland, which is good news. But meanwhile, the Supreme Court has granted a request by Trump to allow him to stop payments of a critical food assistance program called the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, or SNAP for short. This is all while the US government is in shutdown. In case you're wondering what that might mean to American citizens, apparently there are 42 million Americans who rely on SNAP payments to keep from going hungry. And meanwhile, there's a new ballroom being built at the White House. Linda, is this something that you've been aware of? Shutdown in America?
Oh gosh, I mean, I think it's the longest shutdown for many, many decades. I remember under Obama's time, there was a couple of very short shutdowns, but this is major. And Trump just doesn't give a toss, Brian, about anybody, any people, how they're living, how families are living, the poor. And he's just said, he said that there shouldn't be interim payments on this SNAP, Scottish Nutritional something payment. Brian, you mentioned it, which is basically to help really poor families. America doesn't give out welfare lightly. America's welfare payments are pretty close to the poverty line themselves. So this is the poorest people that qualify for this. It was started in Kennedy's time, I think, with pilot programs and moved through. So we're talking the first time in 60 odd years. These people are not getting their payments. And what's absolutely horrifying is that the Supreme Court of the USA, the ultimate body that is supposed to protect the rights of the citizens, as per a very fine constitution upon which the USA is built, has just said, no, it's all right, let them starve. Don't pay them any interim payments. And that was overturning a previous ruling by a federal judge. So the fact that Trump in his last term packed the Supreme Court with his picks is now bearing fruit for him, but it's certainly given seriously hard times to many families in the USA.
Thank you, Linda. Yeah, you're right. It's called the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, SNAP
Right.
for short. And apparently, 1 in 8 families get $188 a month per person per month, which works out about $6 a day. So it's drastic, as you were saying. So the next item is, it seems such a long time ago since we had COP26 here in Glasgow, but that was just 4 years ago, back in 2021. Now we've got COP30 is upon us, starting to in Belém in Brazil imminently. Meanwhile, 2025 has been one of the warmest years on record. There have been many extreme weather events across the globe. Thankfully not too bad here in Scotland, but we have had wildfires this summer. And there's been an unprecedented ice melt with glaciers disappearing across the globe. The UN says greenhouse gas emissions will now see global temperatures exceed 1.5 degrees centigrade, likely within the next decade. So, Linda, there's a lot at stake here, isn't there? And yet,
Yeah.
2 of the largest greenhouse gas emitters in the world, the United States and China, won't be present at COP30. Can we expect to see much from the summit this year without them?
Well, their presence has always been felt to really validate what's going on, but if you actually look behind their presence, there's not an awful lot that has been done to move things forward by either nation, as far as I can see. Certainly in the US, there's a lot of good things said for a long time, but of course Trump has blown a hole in all of that because he doesn't buy into any of what he calls the green agenda. China, they announce things that they're doing, and in particular regions of China, you can see where they have cut down on things. But then in other regions of China, you can see where they're ramping it up. So overall, they're not doing much either. There's been quite a lot of good stuff from some of the smaller nations, though, talking about what they want to achieve and a recognition of what needs to be done. I think it's very sad that when, for many, many years, here in the UK and across Europe, we have been talking about the worry of the rainforests in Brazil and the way they were being stripped of resources and land and trees, of course, that this was having a huge impact on the planet. And so here we have a president in Brazil who is, fronting a big campaign to protect it and making promises, yet the UK Starmer has said, no, we're not going to contribute to that. I think that's very short-sighted thinking. So there are a lot of good initiatives going on. I think the will is there from most places. Whether the resources are there in most places is a very different thing because, as we know, it is generally the areas like lots of Africa without resources who need assistance from those of us with resources, and that hasn't always been happening. So I refuse to get terribly depressed about it, and certainly not just on the back of these two players not turning up. So there's a lot of goodwill there. I think governments are starting to realise that their voting public expect them to be doing things. I think it's now about, all the surveys show, up to 70% of people are seriously worried about the planet. And when you look at the demographics of that, it's young people generally. So I think politicians have got to look at that and recognise what people want. So more pessimistic than I was a few years ago, but not totally pessimistic. Still got a bit of optimism.
Thank you, Linda. Thankfully, Scotland will be represented at COP30, whereas here at home, the Scottish Government has published its draft climate change plan, which it hopes will deliver cleaner air, warmer homes and new job opportunities. Scotland hosted COP26 back in 2021. So I'm wondering, Linda, why is the Scottish Government's plan still a draft plan? Why isn't it maybe, or shouldn't it already be a reality?
Indeed. Though, I mean, in an ideal world, these things become reality very quickly, but we're not in an ideal world. Things change. And it sounds like a bit of an old trope now, but since we started talking about all these things, Brian, there's been major things happened in the world. There's the ongoing war in Ukraine. I hate to mention it again because it sometimes gets overdone, but COVID made huge issues, held a lot of things back. I haven't followed everything hugely closely as far as it's concerned, but I do remember, time passes quickly. I seem to remember a discussion in Parliament last year or even the year before, where there was a very honest recognition by Scotland's government that they couldn't meet the targets that had been in the original plan. So it takes a brave minister to stand up and say these things, but that was done. So this, I understand from what I've read, is the new draft plan, taking all these things into account, and it covers, I think it's now net zero by 2045. I can't remember where it was at before, but it covers emissions of cars, it looks at buildings, lots of woodland work to be done, peatland restoration again, and of course a big emphasis on renewables and the just transition. So I suspect it will be a draft plan because they will be wanting people to respond to it, whether that be non-governmental organisations in the field, charities, etc., professional bodies, the industry and individuals. And I would imagine that the full plan will come back to Parliament once there have been perhaps some amendments made covering what people have written in with.
Thank you, Linda. The aim of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees is often described as a goal. Do you think it'd be better if we talked about it as being a barrier beyond which we must not cross, or is language something to do with this?
Oh, I don't know. I suppose it's that difficult thing about getting the language right so that you can encourage people but not scare them and not make them say, oh, well, what's the point then? And not do anything, let's live for today and just see what happens. So I think it's quite difficult to get the language correct. Having said that, I think sometimes it can be a problem setting goals because when you don't meet them, people then get cynical about it and perhaps then become a bit despondent and don't bother making efforts. So I suspect that's what's behind it.
Sorry, Linda. I'm just thinking countries maybe that invest in renewables and ditch fossil fuels. I suppose China is actually doing quite well in that. Are they going to be the ones that are going to become the countries that are going to be the richest in the end if they embrace the new technologies?
There's that anomaly of China. Sometimes it's difficult to get information. They are doing great stuff on some renewable things, but they're also plundering land all over the place. Look at the Tibetan Plateau. I mean, there's a an environmental disaster waiting to happen with what they're taking out of there, and the displacement of the people from that area. So China's a real difficult one, and I'm never quite sure what to read into the figures they produce about things. So I get frustrated believing that Scotland could do so much more in the renewable industry. We've been talking about for years how so many wonderful initiatives get started in Scotland, and then you get machinery manufactured elsewhere because Scotland's not an independent nation, doesn't have the resources and the decision-making powers to allow them to really capitalise on what we've got and what we can have and what we can achieve. So if you look at Scotland's situation, we could be huge in this, and we have had governments, since, I would say, certainly from 2007, but even a bit before that, we had governments that really wanted to push this. What we need now are the other political parties that don't believe in independence, but say they believe in Scotland. We need them to stand up and start talking about the national grid, start talking about renewables properly, start talking about the manufacturing and investment in resources, start talking about what Scotland could achieve instead of trying to defend a UK Labour government that talks about thousands of jobs in the north of Scotland and then completely backtracks. So the frustration of that is huge. No, I don't. Back to your original question, I don't think China will become a world leader in it, because as well as fossil fuels and everything else, it's about mineral extraction, and they're carrying on with that hugely. I think America's been set back massively by Trump. So I think it is up to the smaller nations, and I suspect it's the smaller independent nations who will come out on top with this. I would love Scotland to be part of that.
Thank you, Linda. And also, conversely, we're often told that the big differences are going to be made by major industries and governments, like not by you and me on a daily basis. And yet, I don't know how it was where you live, but in Glasgow last week it was warm. It was like a lovely spring day, and you go into the supermarket at the cash desk, people are mounting up their messages. The cashier says, "Do you want a plastic bag?" And everybody, it seems, says yes. I mean, what has to happen before people on a daily basis are going to make a difference?
Well, I think it has to be seen from the top down that they are making a difference. I mean, there's actually, to be optimistic about the plastic bag thing, uh, bringing in the plastic bag levy has made a difference. Maybe we should up it. I mean, I for one I'm terribly guilty of this, Brian, and a lot of people are. I could probably find over 100 of these cloth bags if I just went round every bit in the house. But far too often I turn up at a shop and I've forgotten to put them in the car. I shouldn't be driving at the shop, but I do. Um, that happens all too often, and you end up with a plastic bag. Maybe we should up the price of these. Maybe we should be seriously saying these shall not be manufactured anymore. So if somebody wants a bag in the supermarket, they're going to have to pay, I don't know, £1.50, £2, whatever. I think they have to get a lot harder. And if we can get the message right, individuals will understand that. But it has to start at the top. It has to start with the resources of governments in making houses properly weatherproof and properly insulated, so energy zero housing. We have to be doing all these things. The rehabilitation of older properties that are very, very difficult to achieve these figures with. And we're now hearing that the UK government's talking about taxing electric car drivers. I mean, that is absolute lunacy when you look at what we're supposed to be trying to achieve in climate change. So it has to come from the top. People see results from the top, they will start doing their bit with a lot more grace. And I think that's what we're missing at the moment.
Yeah, thanks, Linda. Maybe some of the viewers would maybe give us an idea of if they would be willing to pay more than just a couple of pence for a plastic bag, because it seems to me that they're almost being treated like a single-use plastic when they're supposed to be reusable. But I think we best move on. So ITV is in
Can I
preliminary.
see
Oh,
before you move on, Brian?
yeah,
I
yeah.
just thought of something else. I'm getting in my high horse here, just with you talking about
Go for it.
plastic.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what would really make a difference was get rid of some of that blooming packaging that supermarkets use. I get really, I deliberately try to buy stuff that is not packaged in layers of plastic. And they may well say that it's better than it used to be, but it's still not good enough. That in itself would make a difference. Back to paper, recyclable paper bags and string bags.
But Linda, that's another interesting thing is I think people have forgotten how to use paper bags because the number of times I'm walking along a street in Glasgow and there's, one of the big paper bags from one of the high street chains, clothing companies and the like, and people are put them down when they're waiting for the bus or something like that, or just to chat, forgetting that the streets are wet, it's been raining, and then they pick up the bag and the arses out of it and all their shopping's all... I don't know how many times I've seen that, and I think people have forgotten how to use paper bags. But I'm with you.
Yeah.
Um,
I remember, this is, gosh, I'm feeling ancient now, but I remember my granny ironing the brown paper bags and paper. So let's move on from that before I get put off.
yeah, the good old days. They weren't so good, maybe. ITV is in preliminary discussions to sell its broadcasting business to Sky for approximately £1.6 billion. We're just wondering, what will the sale of ITV mean for the media plurality in Scotland? Will it finally see STV being swallowed up by Sky and its US owners Comcast if they're successful in the purchase bid? Linda, again, this Sky Comcast thing, I don't mean to belittle this, but it seems to... Am I the only one who is reminded by Terminator and the Skynet when you think about STV being bought up by Comcast and Sky?
I don't understand your reference. You've obviously got different tastes than I do in
A bit of
broadcast.
sci-fi.
Oh, is it? I'm not into sci-fi, Brian. I've tried many times, can't get there. But yeah, I'm a wee bit concerned about it. I'm quite interested. Looking back, we're saying Comcast, which everybody just reckons is Sky. And I was looking back, and the last bid to buy ITV was by NTL, and it was blocked by the Murdochs at the time, who bought out lots of shares so that NTL couldn't take it over. So it's quite interesting that we've now gone full circle. That was back in 2006. We've now gone full circle, and here we have Sky, Comcast, wanting to buy over ITV. Wee bit concerned, as we've all been for many years, about both the print media and the broadcast media all ending up controlled by a very small cohort of people. And I think that's a concern here as well, and a concern for public sector broadcasting generally. When you look at it in the round, for Scotland, I think it's a worry. I wouldn't pretend to understand the complete financial setup of STV within ITV. I haven't had time to look into that, but it's obviously going to have an effect if ITV if ITV if ITV are bought over, although STV is a separate company, I know they have big links with ITV and could become very, very vulnerable. In one way, I'm glad it's not the studio stuff. They're only talking about the broadcasting element being bought over. But that in itself is worrying because that's where people get their information and their news. So yes, I have concerns about the future of broadcasting in this country.
So you mentioned Rupert Murdoch. I mean, that was the first thing I thought about when I heard that Sky was going to buy up STV, and I thought, oh, Rupert Murdoch. But Murdoch sold Sky to Comcast in something like, a good wee while ago there. You might even have said it. So Murdoch isn't in the frame. But when you think of Murdoch in the news and Sky, and you think of the hacking scandals.
Absolutely, and the family influence.
But are we maybe overreacting? I mean, although Comcast isn't perfect, I looked it up and it was dubbed the worst company in America by The Consumerist in 2010 and 2014, apparently. So But do you think people will overreact thinking it's Murdoch when really it's a conglomerate, a corporate body that's going to swallow it
No,
up?
because in all these things, there's still a big influence there by the Murdochs in broadcasting and press. I'm absolutely sure of that. And if you look at them all, and no matter all these conglomerates in this arm and that arm, you generally find there is a very small band of people who are right at the top and who are controlling things. So I think folk are right to be concerned. Um, the very name independent TV, just will not apply anymore.
Yeah. The other issue is that it looks like if all the news stations are going to be owned by one company, like Channel 4 News. I can't think of all the others that ITN, ITV News. I've got a list here somewhere. Channel 5 News, Sky News, and possibly what's going to be left of what little's going to be left of STV News. So is this, if it's all coming from one company, we're all going to be getting told the same thing from the same people with the same view, the same.
Well, we've seen that with our newspapers, and when you think about the very good local newspapers that not all that long ago used to operate across Scotland, then they all started to get bought in by the same groups. And I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but I do know that newspapers local to me, local press, are all owned by the same company as the Daily Record. So, and they're more or less sharing news across social media and websites, etc. So yeah, it's very, very difficult to get an independent voice. And that's a problem. And that's why I'm pleased to come on to Broadcasting Scotland so often, and why so many former colleagues are. It's because there are independent voices saying what they think. It might not always be sensible, it might not always be so-called newsworthy for the big companies, but it's honest people giving honest opinions. And that is what is, I think, really lacking in both broadcast and print in Scotland these days.
Yeah, talking about independent news sources, I think it's in the Guardian, and they, like Broadcasting Scotland, that when you read an article for free, they make an appeal at the end for you to donate something to
Yeah.
them. And they've changed the pitch and said that one of the founders of the Guardian, back in the 20s or 30s, I think, gave up his personal share in the Guardian newspaper and put it into a trust so that it could never be bought. And so the Guardian, I think they say, can never be bought. Do you think maybe news organisations like STV should be nationalised? Can you see the Scottish Government taking over STV News to keep it safe?
Well, it couldn't happen under devolution because broadcasting's reserved. I certainly think that in an independent Scotland, we have to preserve public broadcasting. And there are models to look at. You can look at the model in Ireland, for example, and there are other European nations which have models. To get it right, though, government has to be hands off. So it's not as simple as saying the government run the news channel, because then that's problematic. The government could ensure that an independent news channel prevails. And I think that's really important. And public service broadcasting is important. It may not just be about turning your TV on anymore. We can do these things in all sorts of innovative ways now. This programme I'm on is innovative. Who would have thought 20 years ago that this could be done on a phone or on a computer? So, yeah, I think it's awful that Scotland doesn't have its own upfront broadcasting. We had a broadcasting commission back in 2007 to 2009, I think. And, it, it said quite clearly that a nation should be able to look at the world and look at itself through its own eyes, not through the eyes of others who decide what's good for them. Not having your news tagged on at the end of other news, and not having canny wee programmes that say, oh, we're dealing well, we're giving the Scots some good work, some good output. It's all wrong. We should have our own stations. So That's a very different thing from saying STV should be nationalised, but it's about the right of a nation to have its own broadcasting.
Thank you, Linda. I liked your reference to John Robertson's The News Where You Are. It's nicely done. And speaking of the pressures that journalism or the press is under, we attended, Broadcasting Scotland attended the International Press Institute World Congress for 2025, which was held in Vienna at the end of October. The Congress focused on media freedom and innovation, as Linda was saying there. So we've got some edited highlights from the footage that we took when we were in Vienna at the conference.
Broadcasting Scotland attended the International Press Institute's 75th World Congress in Vienna at the end of October, under the theme Defending the Future of Free Media. There, members recognised the achievements and heard the experiences of journalists from around the world operating under authoritarian and anti-free speech regimes. Over the 3 days at Schönbrunn Palace, there was a packed 3 days of events, so here's a sample of some of the events that Broadcasting Scotland attended. The Congress's opening remarks were delivered by Martin Gergely, the chair of IPI's executive board, and Beata Meinl-Reisinger, Austria's Minister of Foreign Affairs. Broadcasting Scotland also attended a special conversation with Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, who has spoken out against democratic backsliding across the world and rising inequality, saying that reports show 83% of the world's countries meet the World Bank's definition of high inequality. A professor of Columbia University and a Nobel Prize winner for economics, he's been a frequent critic of US President Donald Trump, urging Europe this September that any deal made with the president isn't worth the paper that it's written on. The Congress's opening panel saw 5 journalists, Natalia Antileva, Kundi Dixit, Khadija Patel, and 2 winners of this year's IPI Freedom Hero Award, Gustavo Gariti and Martin Barron, discussing journalists' fight against authoritarianism and disinformation and the resilience of journalists in the face of this. Friday's events included Beyond Survival, Supporting Impactful Journalism in Exile, a panel in which 5 journalists, Masha Myers, Gunal Safarova, Stanislav Ishkevich, Safi Karimi and Dora Luz Romero, discussed their lived experiences as exiled journalists and the hurdles that they face in their professional as well as personal lives. Saturday morning's events included Frontline Voices, Women Reporting War, where Rabina Margosian, Zahra Nader, Ma Yagi and Anna Babinets discussed the struggle not only of the risks and complexities of war reporting, but also the unique experiences of female reporters in conflicts. Anna Babinets, Ukrainian journalist specialising in army corruption and contributor to the Pulitzer Prize-winning Panama Papers project, spoke to Broadcasting Scotland about the event and the death of her friend and colleague, Victoria Roshchina, who was killed in Russian custody after being arrested while reporting Russian war crimes.
Anna, nice to see you after a long time. What are you here for?
Nice to see you. I'm here first for accepting award for my colleague who was killed in Russian prison. It was great journalist. I knew her, and yesterday she was awarded, but unfortunately she has died. And I accepted that because we were doing investigation about her death in Russian prison, and I had a speech, and it was important message I wanted to bring, that Ukrainians and Russians and Ukrainian journalists and Russian journalists are not equal in that war, so that we are not like both victims. That Victoria, the journalist who came to occupied by Russian territories, she did that work because it were no Russian journalists who would do that, because all of them in exile, and Victoria just did work for all Russian journalism, and it's so sad that she died. So this is one of the reasons. Another reason I spoke today at the panel about women during the war, and mostly I told how our work as investigative agency changed in war times, because basically we are classic investigative center. We're covering corruption, big stories about money laundering and big crimes, but when the full-scale invasion started, we changed a little bit, and half of our work now it's war crime reporting. So we investigate the crimes committed by Russians in Ukraine. So we're doing this war, and on the other hand, we're still doing corruption stories. And so we were talking about it, how it's about difficulties of work as women during the war, because we also have other obligation in front of our kids, families, team, and how to work, how to manage all the stuff during the war. So that's what we were talking. It was nice for me to talk to journalists from who covering Gaza, from journalists who is from Armenia and from Afghanistan, how they cover their countries. And it's, on one hand, war is war, and it's a lot of very similar stuff, but on the other hand, it's a lot of, a lot of black colors of the war, and you can predict what will be next. And in every country, it's different. And we were sharing, mostly it was not panel, it was like mostly psychotherapist session, because we were talking, we will try even find the word how to express that, because all of us are not native speaking English, and we were trying to find this vocabulary to explain what we feel and what we experience. And it was actually nice to know that other women in other parts of the world have a little bit similar experience, and they find the way to manage that. So yeah, so then let's talk about you, why you are here, and what is the future of investigative journalism, if you know.
Well, so I'm here to talk at a panel about collaboration, the future of investigative collaboration. And you are one of our partners. You've been working with ICIJ for many, many years, and I hope for many more. It will be interesting to see what other journalists will have to say. I have a different perspective, maybe because ICIJ often coordinates collaborations, while some partners maybe look at from more the local angle. So it will be a conversation, I hope. I've heard a lot of pessimistic views on the future of investigative collaboration, and I think I will try to to explain how actually I am more optimistic. I think now more than ever collaboration is important, because there are journalists in situations, in difficult situations. I mean, of course, your center as well. For many reasons, there is someone who's at war, and other people who have economic difficulties, others who are in exile and cannot report on their own country, and by collaborating with others, they can find strength as well as resources to bring new stories to the public. And that's where it was great to be here, to see many of our partners, and to really meet them in person and to bond and have a normal conversation with them that is not through Zoom meetings, and to again understand the value of what ICIJ does, and I hope how we can keep supporting these good journalists around the world.
Sila Alechi, who spoke in the previous clip with Anna, went on to be the speaker at The Future of Investigative Journalism, a panel later on Saturday which discussed attacks on press freedom, a reduction in audiences' trust in the news, the use of AI, and media outlets' increased competition for funding. Later that day, Media Actually Comes to Vienna's live podcast took place, where RNW Media's Sam Massetti Nyamwange discussed the audience trust in media and how newsrooms are attempting to gain and retain trust. Broadcasting Scotland later spoke to Nyamwange about the event.
My name is Sam Massetti Nyamwange. I am originally from Kenya, but I live in the Netherlands. I work with RNW Media, an international media development organization, and we work with partners across the world to promote public good and to advance human rights through independent digital public interest media. I work with our partners in sub-Saharan Africa, in the countries that we work in, and we are seeing a lot of great insights from that part of the region. We are here at the IPI World Congress and Media Innovation Festival. We held a workshop yesterday on promoting ethical AI in newsrooms, and that was an interesting conversation where we had participants talk about their case studies, how they're using AI for financial viability, but also in their editorial work, in their admin work, in their newsrooms to make life easier. And what came out of that session is that our focus should be on encouraging assistance and augmentation of AI to human work. We also held a live podcast this morning on audience and trust, and we had two brilliant guests who gave us their perspectives on how do we develop audiences as media and as journalists, and how do we encourage trust between us and them. That is an interesting podcast that's called Media Actually. Please look out for it, and we'll see you soon.
The Congress closed on Saturday night with closing remarks delivered by IPI's Executive Director, Scott Griffin, discussing member resolutions and IPI's future.
Linda, those clips talked about authoritarianism,
Broadcasting
which is canny after I suggested that STV might become nationalised by the Scottish Government, and you very swiftly said that maybe sounds like a government-owned news source might sound like propaganda. The clip talked about the dangers that women face in reporting in war zones. In fact, it's lethal in some cases. Trust in the news, collaboration, pessimism versus optimism, and the use of AI. So is there anything in there that you'd maybe want to highlight?
Oh, I think it was all really interesting. I'm sure it was a fascinating conference, and it's brilliant that Broadcasting Scotland were there, because, this is the only place I've seen any reference to it. I don't watch much television, I have to say, but I do read the press, and I didn't see much reference at all to the International Press Conference, which is a great shame. Pretty certain that some of their talk would also be about the situation of journalists in Gaza, Palestinian journalists that have been killed and injured in Gaza, and the fact that investigative journalism, real investigative journalism, is a fantastic thing that we have in this world. And, without investigative journalists, we would not know what was happening. And they put themselves in danger day and daily in many places in the world. It's not, all journalists sitting in offices and reading press releases from political parties and reproducing them in their stories. It's folk going out there into war zones, into dangerous situations, and making sure that the rest of the world knows when they bear witness to what's happening. So I'm sure a lot of that would have been covered as well. And it's a fascinating profession. It really is.
And do you think, is there any chance that the Scottish Government could recognise the importance of media plurality and media freedom if they were to invite the international press to deliver to deliver it in Scotland, maybe at some time in the future?
I think that would
that
be a wonderful
goer?
idea, Brian. I think it certainly would be a goer. I mean, it could come from, government level, asking them to come to the country. It could even come from city level. I mean, Glasgow has hosted some major events over the last few years, as we know. So, yeah, I think that'd be a great idea. And worth mentioning that for some years, the Scottish Parliament hosted the World Press Awards. As they had the first exhibits before the World Press Awards exhibition went round the rest of the world, and the Scottish Parliament hosted that, I think, 3 years in a row, maybe. So, yeah, I think that would be absolutely super. And if they've not done so already, I hope the representatives watching this channel will certainly get on to Angus Robertson and say, right, Angus, get on the phone and get this sorted, because I think that's a brilliant idea.
We can put out an invitation to Mr. Robertson if he wants to come onto the show to maybe to discuss it, or we could even just meet and have a chat about it. But just to quickly bookend the show, you mentioned Gaza, and I couldn't help but thinking that with a ceasefire supposedly being in place in Gaza, you'd like to think it would now be safe for journalists to go back into Gaza when they were excluded before, but that's maybe not strictly the case.
No. Gosh, the food aid doesn't get in, never mind journalists.
But I think that's us. We're out of time. So thank you, Linda, for your contributions.
Thank you, Brian.
No, not at all. But so that is it. That is this week's Full Scottish. But before we go, can we just remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of you, our supporters. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. We can only exist with your support. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you could afford £5 a month, please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, or simply donate whatever you can afford. So thank you once again to Linda Fabiani. Finally, on this Remembrance Sunday, Broadcasting Scotland pays respect to those who gave their lives that small nations can be free. So goodbye and thank you for watching.